Hello from me, Roshni Gajjar, and welcome to Lift as We Rise. I think you and I are in for an extraordinary hour today as I take this conversation into the future with Matthew Griffin. Matthew Griffin is a futurist and a strategic advisor to the G7 and to the G20. He's the founder and CEO of the 311 Institute, a global futures and deep futures think tank, and a singular mission to help organizations envision, build, and lead an inclusive, prosperous, and sustainable future for everyone. Matthew is known and globally recognized as the advisor to advisors. He's also the founder of the World Futures Forum. Matthew, it's an absolute honor to be having this conversation with you today. Welcome.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Roshni, and hi, everyone.
Matthew, I know that you've been traveling quite a bit for some game-changing events and engagements. Can you share with us some recent engagements that you've had?
Yeah, sure. So I was in Hamburg a couple of weeks ago, where we were discussing the future of global shipping with sort of Port of Hamburg, based in the German government. Literally on the same day, I then had to jet back to London, where we had an event, or I had an event with Samsung. So with Samsung, we were talking about life in 2069, which in their particular case is sort of quite pertinent because 2069 is the centennial anniversary of their first televisor. And to everyone else, basically they're going to know the televisor as the TV. So that was an exciting one. Then last week I was having a lot of meetings basically with Middle Eastern governments, which was really centered around the future of work, education, jobs and skills. And then, I mean, there were a couple of other events basically with the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's been a busy couple of weeks.
Yeah, Matthew, on that basis, just thank you very, very much for investing time to speak with us today. Now, before we get into it, I've been really excited for this conversation. And when I was planning it, the first thought that popped into my mind, interestingly, it took me back to my childhood, I guess. And one of my favorite movies at the time was a movie called FX Murder by Illusion. I don't know if you remember it. It was a movie about the US Justice Department who hired a special effects film technician to fake a mob killing as part of a witness protection program. And I realized that was my first glimpse into the world of illusions, visual effects, and what I guess we now call deep fakes. So I'm sitting here in South Africa, you're sitting there in the UK, you're a futures guy, you've got a background in intelligence and security and IT, you're the crystal ball of global leaders. Matthew, how do I know that I'm speaking to the real Matthew Griffin and not to a deep fake?
So at the moment, because deep fakes aren't sophisticated enough. So actually deep fakes are a subset of what we call synthetic content. Now, when we have a look at misinformation and disinformation, as trends, those have actually been around since the dawn of time. So they're nothing actually new at all. We saw Stalin literally photoshopping people out of photos, back at the start of the 20th century, let alone anything else. The tools that we use today are just simply more sophisticated. But when we actually have a look at deepfakes, for example, deepfakes basically are the use of artificial intelligence to manipulate content, principally video. However, when we have a look at synthetic content is the use of artificial intelligence to create new forms of content from scratch. So when we have a look at synthetic content, we see new synthetic content across the music, text, audio, imagery, as well as virtual reality worlds and videos. So videos and movies and so on and so forth. When we have a look at deepfakes, though, deepfakes are becoming more sophisticated, but when it comes to trying to create a lifelike representation of a human, deepfakes aren't really the best way to do it, unless you want to twist someone's words like Nancy Pelosi, for example, that we saw, and try to get them to say something else. Putin, I've got videos basically of ex-President Donald Trump actually singing Christmas carols. We've got Eminem doing deepfake raps. We've got the creators of South Park that are now creating deepfake video series, which you can see on YouTube and so on and so forth. But when we talk about trying to replicate the real-time experience of talking to a person, that's more in the realm of what we call digital humans. So we have platforms, particularly platforms like Soul Machines. So a digital human is a digital representation or a digital clone of a fictional or non-fictional person that is able to respond to people in real time using natural language, and that is able to understand them in natural language as well. So this is really where we start talking about digital humans having neural network brains. So, for example, if you have a look at your sat-nav's responses are pre-programmed. Digital humans with neural network brains are increasingly lifelike, basically from a resolution perspective, from a behaviors perspective in terms of their mannerisms, body language, all that kind of stuff, their facial expressions. But when we start talking about the ability to create realistic synthetic audio, we already have those technologies with Google and WaveNet and DeepMind, which is one of Google's artificial intelligence subsidiaries. But when we start talking about the ability for these digital humans to talk in the same way as humans, with a human-like expression, accents, emotions, and everything else, they are getting a lot better. They're not perfect yet, but again, we do have digital humans that can talk with a Birmingham accent, an American accent. They can use slang. They can get cross. They can cry. So that's a whole conversation in itself. But if you want to look like if you want to fool someone into thinking that they are talking to you when they're not, it's a digital human, not so much a deepfake.
Right, Matthew. I think we'll take comfort from the fact that we're speaking to a real person there. I just wanted the listeners to be absolutely sure, and that's why we're bringing you a video today. So let's go into your work of the future and deep futures. And let's take what's happened in the last 2 years as an example of how this plays out in reality. Let me ask you this. Was COVID-19 a black swan? In other words, was the event foreseen, or could it have been foreseen by the G7 and G20 leaders, or even by healthcare companies 15 or 20 years ago?
So foreseeable. But there's a couple of things I can use to back that up. So not only was it foreseeable, it was predicted. Now, and it was predicted in a variety of different ways. So firstly, when you actually have a look at the rise of epidemics, less so pandemics, but when you have a look at the rise of epidemics themselves, so for example, SARS, MERS, Ebola, HN5-1, swine flu, etc., we've actually been seeing an acceleration of the number and the intensity of epidemics basically around the world really for the past 20 years. So that's increasingly where people blame humanity's impact on nature, where humans and nature are increasingly coming into conflict with one another. But from a coronavirus perspective, coronaviruses are really quite unique in that they are probably one of the most adaptable viruses on the planet. They're able to take different DNA strands, combine them together to create something new, which is where we then see them crossing transgenic boundaries. However, so on the one hand, we kind of had some statistical information that we could actually look at, seeing an increase in the number of epidemics around the world, and we could factor in that at some point one of these is going to get a little bit nasty and cause some global mayhem. Secondly, we saw organizations like DARPA, which is a part of the US government, as well as individuals like Bill Gates, saying it is a matter of time. It's not a matter of when or if, well, it's not a matter of if we see a pandemic, it's a matter of when we see a pandemic. So Bill Gates, about 5 years ago, was talking up the need for a proper pandemic response system. When we have a look at DARPA, so DARPA is the bleeding edge military research arm of the American Army. They started a program called the P3 program, which was a pandemic-focused program which aimed to identify the pandemic, so what was causing it, come up with a treatment, and then be able to scale that treatment globally within the space of 2 months. So the P3 program is still ongoing, obviously, and that's now been supercharged because of COVID. However, so we've got two different ways to foresee some pandemics coming, but probably one of the most interesting in my mind, which highlights just how, should we say, blinkered world leaders can actually be, is this one. So when we have a look at the financial cost of the global pandemic, it's estimated that roughly the global pandemic has cost the global economy about $40 trillion. Now, if you want to start the next pandemic, you need $100 and an eBay account, and that's it. And this is why. So 3 years ago, researchers in Canada managed to find the genomic sequence for the extinct horsepox virus. Bearing in mind that one thing that we do as a society is we're very good at sequencing viruses, organisms, and all kinds of different things. So this is kind of part of the genome sequencing project. So they found the genome of the extinct horsepox virus. They, in their case, spent $100,000 buying customized DNA from eBay, which you can do via a company called Twist Bioscience. They do synthetic DNA, but there are also others. They recompiled the previously extinct horsepox virus into a live culture. Now, for those that don't know, the horsepox virus is part of the pox family of viruses. The R rating for a horsepox virus is about 3 to 5, which means it is a lot more contagious than any kind of coronavirus or COVID-19 that we see today, including the Delta variants and Delta Plus variants. What they then did is they then took their research to the World Health Organization about 3 years ago, and you can Google this. You can actually even find the World Health Organization's own public comments on it. And they said, look, today we have the technology to recompile previously extinct, highly contagious, highly deadly viruses like this one. And we think that as world leaders and as global institutions, you should come up with a response and look at this area seriously. So this is a massive bioterrorism threat waiting to happen, for example. Now, suffice to say, the world's leaders, basically as well as the World Health Organization, pretty much shrugged it off. Didn't really do anything. But one of the things that I find highly interesting and worrying, basically, in the World Health Organization report is the World Health Organization at the time said, what struck us the most, basically, about this research was that the researchers were neither heavily funded, heavily resourced, or particularly skilled. And yet this is what they managed to create. So as humans, we are very, very good at ignoring warnings. And we're very, very good at ignoring warnings. We generally only act when the problem is already a problem. And that's exactly what we've seen with the pandemic. Now, it's increasingly likely that world leaders basically will actually take these researchers seriously. But the human status quo means that we generally wait until our house is on fire to put it out, as opposed to actually buying the fire alarms basically, and trying to secure everything before our house catches fire. Maybe we learn from that experience.
Thanks very much for that, Matthew. And that was an important question because that leads me to my next one around stress testing, mitigation plans that have global consequences. So, my thought's always been that catastrophes, disasters, disruptions, they don't happen overnight. But often, only with hindsight, do we identify that, the probability given to those warning signals was probably incorrect. So if we look back on the news highlights over the past 2 years, to me, there's not enough evidence to show that global systems were ready enough to respond to these perfect storms. What am I talking about? I'm talking about floods, fires, pandemic, Suez Canal crisis, stories of child trafficking, ransomware, commercial space travel, the social media scandals, droughts, energy, starvation. I mean, the story goes on. That, in addition to the ongoing geopolitical tensions. So we appreciate that world leaders have had to deal with a lot. So when we look at risk mitigation plans at the global leader level with relation to deep futures, how do the G7 and G20 leaders approach such issues, especially when there's such interconnectivity between the risk and the consequences of a global nature? And I'm asking this, Matthew, because from a business context, we call these types of risks external or non-controllable, yet we've got to formulate strategies around these.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So one of the biggest problems that I see around the world basically is Say, for example, I went to a government and I said, in 10 years' time, half your country will be underwater. And as a result of this, I think that today you should take action to prevent that future. Now, from the government's perspective, they will generally listen a bit. They will go off and they will go and try and quantify that. But from their perspective, putting off a future risk often requires spending a lot of money today, and while that makes sense from a political perspective, almost all of our politicians, except really Vladimir Putin and President Xi, are elected either every 4 years or 5 years. And politicians are elected based on what they can often do for their electorate in the short term. So you can imagine the picture. I go to a G7 government and I say, in 10 years' time, half of your country will be underwater. The way that you can mitigate that is you can spend 20 billion euros today in new infrastructure investments to prevent that. On the one hand, basically those governments, even if they do actually listen, will then try to put policies and projects through that say we will spend $20 billion to offset future floods, at which point their electorate goes, well, wouldn't that $20 billion or euros be better spent on our failing education system, healthcare systems, transport systems, or whatever it happens to be? Then you end up in an endless cycle of debate, and then nothing really gets done. And this is sort of one of the biggest problems that we see with a lot of governments today. Basically, there is a lot of short-term thinking because they have to be elected. If they aren't elected, then they can't make any changes anyway. And this is where China arguably have a fairly interesting model, because President Xi, as we kind of have sort of discussed, President Xi will set the strategy so that he's the pilot of the plane. And then what he's doing is he's just swapping in and out the co-pilots and the crew basically over the next 20 years. We see that a lot in the Middle East as well, with Middle Eastern rulers, basically where they just swap the co-pilots in and out as opposed to changing the pilot in the aircraft. When we have a look at Western democracies particularly, we are changing the pilot in our plane every 4 to 5 years. As we saw with President Trump and President Obama, Obama put in 8 years worth of environmental protections and changes and healthcare policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. President Trump came in and unwound pretty much every single one of them. So from the Americans' perspective, President Trump arguably unwound 8 years worth of policies, reversed policies, which then meant that the Americans lost over potentially 12 years worth of progress, at which point, when you go around China, they go, that was the best thing that the American government could ever have done for us, because while they were reversing all of their policies, investments in science, healthcare, the environment, et cetera, we supercharged ours, and that's what's letting China catch up. In fact, China is caught up in quite a lot of areas now. So when you have a look at the political system is quite fragile. And then in addition to that, we then start having questions about what's more effective, a private organization or governments, bearing in mind that a lot of the changes that we've actually seen at the global level have actually been kickstarted by private organizations, like self-driving cars, like the energy revolution, for example, the electrification of cars, basically with Tesla, and so on and so on. So now we start getting into debates of which type of organization has more powerful to change the world in a meaningful way. Is it A, Google? Is it B, companies like Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg is the president of 3.2 billion people? Does that make him the most powerful person on the planet? Or C, is it governments? And increasingly, particularly when you have conversations with the younger generations, they think private organizations are more able to enact real world change faster than fragile governments who are increasingly deadlocked and stuck basically in their own malaise.
Matthew, that's super interesting, and you've kind of led me on to my next question on a subject that we're both passionate about, which is sustainability. But what strikes me about what you just positioned is that that tension will possibly always perpetuate. And why am I saying that? And this is perhaps a discussion for another day. But when you think about private and the Western democracies, we've become a society of individualism. And in for the greater good, for the long term, I guess we've got to think about the collective. And that requires a broader context, which I guess is hard to sustain. So yeah, that would be an interesting thing to look further into. So on sustainability and build better. So Biden's campaign slogan has implications across the G7 agenda, but build back better has very different meaning in the US versus in a country like South Africa, for example. So if we think about sustainability, and you alluded to it earlier, as the impact of decisions and actions that leaders make and take today to enable future generations to thrive, we also know that future generations could be here on planet Earth, also on other planets. So who, Matthew, is this future generation, and what will they need to thrive? In other words, what does build better mean in the context of deep futures?
So on the one hand, so again, when you have conversations with younger generations, depending on the country, between 54 to 94% of younger generations increasingly think that traditional capitalism is broken. And they kind of have a point. When you actually have a look at traditional capitalism, it's generally responsible for putting profits above people and profits above purpose. So this is why we increasingly see the commoditization of people, the alienation of people. This is where we increasingly see the ravaging, basically, of the planet's resources. So, for example, a stupid example, but one that is unfortunately real. For every ton of carbon in Europe, it costs about 50 euros per ton of carbon to pollute. However, if you want to put that ton of carbon into the ground, it costs about 100 to 120 euros. So we still have a system where it is actually cheaper to pollute than to either regenerate an environment or just not mess that environment up that much. From a futures generations perspective as well, the year 2028 basically is something that should stick in people's minds, because the year 2028 is significant because that is the point in time at which a lot of the world's leading pharmaceutical and biotech companies believe that we will reach something called escape velocity. So escape velocity is the point in time in which we can add more than a year's worth of life to an individual for every year that they've lived because of new breakthrough medical advances. Putting these on the table, today basically we can 3D print human organs, so bone, skin, corneas, livers, hearts. We have a company in Israel that recently 3D printed a beating human heart. We have in vivo gene editing, but we have all kinds of really science fiction-like healthcare technologies actually coming through now. So when we have a look at the future of healthcare, in the next 10 to 20 years, if you are 40-ish now, maybe 50, but if you're 40-ish to 50-ish now, we see a point in time where new technologies will be able to add another 30 years to your lifespan. Which then brings us to this question. If you think that you are going to be dead by the year 2040 or 2050, and you won't actually get to see Florida, for example, sink under the Atlantic Ocean, you're actually increasingly likely to be wrong. Now, if we add an extra 30 years to your life, which means that you are likely to experience basically some of these increasingly what we're being told cataclysmic environmental events, do you recycle more today? If you're the CEO of an organization, do you suddenly make your organization more sustainable? Do you love the circular economy all of a sudden? So there are these sort of fundamental ways in which new technologies and new innovations are actually changing what it means to be human, the human condition, but also our attitude towards one another and the planet. And then from a capitalist perspective, we see the rise of what we call ethical capitalism. So ethical capitalism is based on something called the finance of mutuality. It was sort of brought to life in 2010 by organizations like Mars. And it's a construct basically that says, what's the right level of profit for my business? Which is a bit of an odd one. Basically, when you actually have a look at most businesses, they just say, well, I want to make as much money as possible. But when we talk about investments, ethical capitalism favors positive investments in people, resources, as well as the financial stability and well-being of the organization itself. So, for example, when we have a look at things like the fair trade platforms, if we pay farmers a better wage, but then that's one thing, we feel a little bit happier with ourselves. But ethical capitalism goes one step further. It's how can we improve the lives of those individuals, the lives of their families, the lives of their communities? From a planetary perspective, if we are deforesting part of the planet, then ethical capitalism will say, well, we should actually invest in not just reforestation, but we should invest in rewilding, environmental regeneration, these sorts of things. So it's a very, very different approach to capitalism. And I do see organizations, for example, some of the companies basically I work with, organizations like Unilever, are actually starting to move the dial there. Mars, as I said, basically we do have a lot of other sort of Fortune 250 type organizations that are increasingly moving in that direction. I won't say they've actually done it yet, but they're moving in that direction. And then similarly, basically, when we have a look at the global financial markets, the European Union, for example, is now promoting ESG. So the vast majority of investors will, like global asset managers like BlackRock, Legal & General, and everything else, will say, we will only invest in your organization if you can show us that you are doing the right things for people and planet, so ESG, so environment, social and governance, as well as CSR. And if you aren't, then we will consider dumping your shares. So when you actually have a look at the global asset management industry at the moment, there's over $34 trillion invested in assets that promote ESG, which actually is over 30% of all global assets. So we are starting to make big strides. We are moving in the right direction. There is a lot more to do. I mean, if you have a look at the transition from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy, for example, the hitting net zero by 2050, Bloomberg estimate it's going to take about $92 trillion to actually get from where we are today to actually achieve net zero in the future. We're spending about $1.7 trillion a year now, basically, on, should we say, decarbonizing different industries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that needs to increase from 1.7 to about $3 to $5 trillion, which then again comes back to this: if it's cheaper for me to pollute than save the planet, I'm going to generally pollute, unless the culture of my company is one where I say, well, isn't there something that I can do to improve the state of the planet while actually still not, losing all of my dividends and all that kind of stuff. So we have solutions. It's generally a case of either investment and or culture change in order to get them deployed.
So Matthew, let's take a deeper dive into the role of big business. And over the weekend, I came across a really interesting conversation with the former chairperson and CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfield. And he said this. He said, I really spent 100% of my time at Goldman Sachs worrying. It's a job, he said, you worry because nobody knows anything and nobody can guess the future. Some people may accidentally be right from time to time, but nobody really knows. And immediately I thought, well, I'm speaking to someone who looks into the future. And just to bring the listeners into, where my mind was going to from a business context. So we've seen stellar performance from traditional tech companies. There's obviously an emergence of disruptors and innovators, and this means that traditional business models and value chains are disrupted. Crypto is more attractive. We're seeing global interest rates drop. The G20 have unexpectedly agreed on a minimum tax rate of 15%. As you pointed out, ESG is a hot topic. The nature of business has transformed. There are talks of universal basic income. People are leaving their jobs. We're now seeing what's called the Great Resignation. Consumer spending is moving towards simpler, more efficient and cleaner choices. Yet we're seeing cybercrime on the rise. We're seeing organized crime and corruption continue to tap into global resources. And despite all this change, Matthew, the financial system still represents the double entry that was created in the 15th century. And this is what asset managers and analysts measure company performance on. So, if we project forward to 2040, what will investors and stakeholders of the future expect from CEOs and from capital markets as a whole?
So, firstly, we've got the issue of reporting. So, if you have a look at Europe and the US, basically there is increasingly the expectation that organizations adopt a more ESG focused approach to business and business operations. However, organizations typically still struggle with, what do you measure? How do you measure it? How do you report it? Increasingly, they also have a bit of an issue on how do they actually communicate this? Because when we actually have a look at how ESG actually translates basically to share price, for example, for every gain that you make in a ESG, so for every sort of improvement in your ESG score that you make, we've been able to see that your share prices will generally result in about a 0.5% gain. For every step back that you make in ESG, your share prices typically drop by about 2 to 3%. So when we start having a look at how investors actually, should we say, decide who is investable and who is not, this is where, again, we kind of have this culture change with investors. So I've always found that the investment community are actually really quite interesting because you have two ways that you can get a company or a society to change. And it applies to all of us. So the first thing I can do is I can tell you to behave in a particular way and try to change your behaviors and try to pander to your common sense. So I say, for example, I think you should recycle more because recycling will help the planet and it will help stave off resource scarcity and maybe climate change, depending what we're doing. I think you should turn off the lights more because then we will need to generate less electricity and we will pollute less, etc., etc. So I can kind of use that carrot where I say, well, I think you should do something because it's the right thing to do. Now, some companies, for example, will do what we say is the right thing just because. They'll go, well, actually, I completely agree, so I'm going to make sure that we turn off all of our buildings' lights so that we use less energy and we emit less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Off we go. There are organizations, though, basically that go, you know what, frankly, I'm not going to bother turning off all the lights because I don't care about our carbon emissions. And frankly, I'm actually going to do the opposite. I'm going to turn all the lights on. And I'm going to keep them on 24/7. In which case, from an investor's perspective, well, what do you actually do there? Well, the vast majority of investors are increasingly saying, well, if you do that kind of thing, we will simply disinvest in your stock and we will dump you from our portfolio. So on the one hand, I can encourage you to do the right thing and I can pander to your better sense, your sense of your better sense. Or I can use a stick and say, if you don't create a more sustainable, environmentally friendly business, if you don't treat your workers better, if you don't give them a proper wage, if you don't give them a proper work-life balance, if you do continue to treat them like commodities, if you do continue to pollute, I will dump your stock like crazy. And what I've seen basically with a lot of the global investor community, particularly kind of the top 20, is when they have actually dumped stocks and dumped companies out of their portfolios, in about 60 to 70% of cases, those companies that have been dumped typically then come back to the investors and say, well, okay, look, what do we need to do to get your approval, to get you to recommend basically our stocks and shares basically to people and actually get us back into your portfolio? In which case it's now well, that thing that we said about turning the lights off, basically and emitting less carbon dioxide, for example, do that. So we do have carrot and sticks, and increasingly we're using both. Now, the carrot is always the better way to go. But the fact of the matter is there are still quite a lot of companies basically that require the stick. And this is sort of where, as I work more and more basically with the investment community, particularly on sustainability agendas, diversity and inclusion, future of work, workforce, and all these kinds of different areas that align with the United Nations SDGs. It's quite interesting to see the impact that a stick can have on a boardroom. It's quite transformative. It's also quite sad in a way that we need to even use the sticks. But it's interesting to watch basically boards that are resistant to change buckle when they realize basically that their shares are getting dumped.
Matthew, it's that ongoing debate of compliance versus ethics, right? And when it comes, that double entry system that I was talking about, we're going to need to find a way of where these interventions for the greater good can be measured in the short term so that they start appearing on the balance sheet or kind of impacting the income statement in a positive way, or we're going to find another way of measuring results, right? So let's go to the boards.
Yeah.
Cosmonologist Carl Sagan said this. He said, if we continue to accumulate only power and not wisdom, we will surely destroy ourselves. And we've seen this happen in the third industrial revolution. Now, the average age of the S&P 500 boards is about 63 and a half years. And with the majority of new appointments occurring between the ages of 60 and 69, mostly male, and mostly with limited diversity. Now, Matthew, with the speed of change and innovation that you talk about, coupled with a massive shift in business context and human behavior, for board leaders listening in today, what do board needs to know and change today to become more future fit and to ensure that we move towards what you called ethical capitalism?
So the first thing to do basically is create something along the lines of a multi-generational board. There's one CEO that runs one of the world's largest insurance companies, basically, that I first met him about 5 years ago. And we were having just a sort of rather general conversation, nothing specific. But the topic of digital came up. And it was when it comes to digital transformation, there's a whole variety of different reasons why you should digitally transform your organization, because it boosts organizational flexibility, agility, the ability to spot and move into new markets, do new things in new ways, all that kind of stuff. This was, as I say, this was sort of just a relatively generic chat, basically, that we were having just before the board meeting. And I said, well, we're already digital. And he was about 65 at the time. And I said, well, we're on social media. And it's like, well, that's not actually digital. And he was like, what? And there was actually another CEO, basically, that I had a conversation with. And this was the CEO, basically, of pretty much the world's largest education company. And he went, tell me about this thing, digital. And, I'm a futurist, basically I'm a strategic advisor. It's not necessarily, I'm not necessarily a digital transformation expert or specialist, et cetera, But when we start having conversations, basically with certainly CEOs, chairmen, those kinds of levels, on the one hand, basically there is this disconnection from technology and what technology is actually helping us achieve today, plus the threats and the opportunities. There are now 3 to 4 generations worth of people actually in business as well. And the experience basically of a 20-year-old within a business is very different to the experience of a 60 or 70-year-old basically within a business. So this is sort of where we look at the concept of multi-generational boards. Increasingly, boards basically should actually have foresight teams. There's still quite a lot of organizations that don't, because the pace of change is now so fast that we can disrupt global markets and global industries basically within a day. For anyone that sort of wants to call me out on that, let's dive down that rabbit hole. So I have a way to disrupt the global financial services system in one day. Technically, I might even be able to do it in 12 hours. So let's dive down that rabbit hole. So in June 2019, Facebook released a new cryptocurrency called Libra. Libra basically was made up of a basket of different currencies, which included the yuan, basically the euro, basically the dollar, et cetera. Now, Facebook has 3.2 billion people. Bearing in mind that at a planetary level, basically we have billions of people connected to the internet. Those billions of people have instant access to new digital products and services as they emerge. provided they aren't blocked by their state governments. So with platforms like Facebook, Facebook could have released Libra, and by midday could have had 20% of its user base using it, which would have equated to between 300 to 500 million people. Now, going down the rabbit hole even further, in the words, not my words, but in the words of the chairman of the People's Bank of China, the chairman of the ECB, the chairman of the Bank of England, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Facebook's cryptocurrency could have disrupted the global financial services industry overnight and changed the state's control of money overnight. The only reason why Facebook Libra, which is now Diem, based out of Switzerland, didn't actually take off was because the regulators said no. And when you go and have a conversation with governments and government regulators, basically say, well, you know, what went on there? They say, well, actually, the concept of Facebook's cryptocurrency, which is actually similar to sort of some of the platforms that we actually see, like WeChat, for example, over in China. The concept of Facebook's Libra cryptocurrency was sound, but we just didn't trust the company, so we vetoed it. And there you go. But when you think about it, we are the most powerful versions of ourselves who have ever existed. And this links into cybercrime as well. As an individual, I can create a product or service. And if it's a digital product or service, if I can hit the right levers, I can release it today. And if I can hit the right executional levers, I could have 3.5 billion people on the planet using it by lunchtime. You know, you've got to hit a lot of levers correctly. And I tell you what, there will be a lot of people listening who'd love to know the secret basically of executing and getting everyone on the planet to download something. Probably involves a cat gif. But we are living exponential times where one individual can either change the global status quo faster than ever before. Imagine Greta Thunberg, for example. Step back 30 years ago. She's living in a Swedish village. You know, she's going, I think, well, okay, how shall I communicate with the world? Well, what I'll do is I'll pick up the phone, I'll write some letters, and I'll try and get in front of some newspapers. You know, it's not going to be the same. She's not going to have the same level of impact that she does today. When we talk about cyber criminals, I can be a hacker sitting in one country, and I can now hack anything on the planet, anywhere. The cost of starting World War III is a lot less, basically, than it would have been to start World War I or II. I don't need as many assets or resources or whatever it happens to be. We are all now more powerful than presidents, prime ministers, kings and queens of the past. And from a cybercrime perspective, as we start seeing the weaponization of artificial intelligence with the likes of robo-hackers that are able to scan millions of lines of code in minutes and then find what we call a proof of vulnerability that I either exploit or patch, we are getting to the point basically where as we bring another 3.5 billion people online, basically with platforms like SpaceX's Starlink system, which is a low Earth orbit satellite communications system, which actually ended up going global in September, it looks like we should end up with about another 150 million hackers. My ability to hack the little old lady that is sitting at the North Pole with her smartphone and drain her bank account is infinitely more possible today than it was 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So when we have a look at the rise of cybercrime since the year 2018 has increased by 600% in revenues. So it now represents, we estimate, about $1 trillion in revenue, basically for cybercrime, which is 1% GDP. When we actually have a look at serious organized crime as a whole, it's generally been growing at about 19% compound over the past 10 years. It now represents about $6 trillion of revenue that, for example, a lot of the governments and tax institutions around the world, like the Italian tax collectors, basically have been able to track. We think serious organized crime brings in revenues of about $6 trillion. And during 2008, Europe's most highly capitalized bank with $248 billion of cash on hand was the Italian mafia. Furthermore, when we actually have a look at cybercrime, there's a platform called Hydra on the deep web. It's estimated that its revenues are $45 billion, which makes it the world's 64th largest company. So now one person is more powerful than ever before. And as an individual, I can use that to do good So I can be the Greta Thunberg and tell everyone, change your behaviors, otherwise I'll set the investors on you. Or alternatively, I can go and become a cyber criminal and just have a look at how much junk mail you're getting right now.
Matthew, this is awfully scary stuff. And hence, my question around the boards is, it's such a complex time. So if you're stepping into a board chairmanship position right now, and let's say you've got a term of 5 or 10 years, there's a lot that one needs to think about. So it's almost like, the partnership between boards, investors, sector leaders, and governments, I think, to try and take the strategy forward as opposed to take a personal agenda around a term forward. I mean, there's so much deep thinking that needs to be done around a different construct to what we call corporate governance. Because it doesn't end here, right? With commercial space travel, we could be leading organizations on another planet, and that brings a whole new dimension to things. Really complex.
And then, from an executive's position, from perspective, normally, basically, so when I do eventually travel around the world, basically, and ask the audiences this question and say, over the past decade, do you think that the speed of change has accelerated, stayed the same, or got slower? 99% of people stick their hands up and they think it's faster. And the other person generally doesn't stick their hand up at all. When I then say this, I say, well, okay, when we actually look forward to 2030, do you think that the world is going to be changing at a faster rate, the same rate as it is today, or a slower rate than today? Again, everyone puts their hands up. So collectively, as a global society, we know that the world is actually changing faster today than at any other point in history, but that rate of acceleration itself is accelerating. So from a board member's perspective, if you have a 10-year plan, bearing in mind that more Western organizations are now starting to put together 20-year plans and 20-year visions, Asian organizations are actually more likely to put together a 50-year plan. And I know that because actually I help them develop these 50-year plans. So organizations like Huawei, for example, basically, which typically is persona non grata, depending on the country you're in, which is always another fun conversation about the impact of geopolitics, basically on a particular organization's fortunes and favors. If we know that the rate of change is accelerating, if you create a 10-year plan today, because everything is accelerating, that's actually more likely to be a 5 to 7 year plan. And your 5-year plan is more likely to actually come to life basically within 3 years. So in which case, the first thing that boards actually have to do is realize basically that the visions and the horizon documents that they are putting together typically are already, if they base them on linear assumptions where tomorrow is a little bit better and the day after is a little bit better and things are a little bit faster, they're generally going to get caught out. And this is sort of one of the biggest things that boards struggle with is this pace of change. Because again, as things accelerate, I used to have 10 years I used to have a 10-year window to see what the next version of my business was going to look like. Industry 4, Industry 5, Industry 6, as we see. However, as everything accelerates, the amount of time that I have as an executive board to understand what's changing and then make the necessary adaptations within my own business so that I'm not run over by the disruption train or run over by the future is itself decreasing. So now, rather than having 10 years to think about what the future of my company might look like when it's offset against the way that markets are evolving, consumer behaviors are evolving, et cetera, I now might actually only have a couple of years. And that speed actually creates its own challenges. And the vast majority of organizations themselves aren't actually set up for the pace of change. If we have a look, for example, at the financial services industry again, banks were worried that they were going to be disrupted by fintechs, and we sort of started that really. We saw banks becoming a little bit nervous about fintechs really about 10 years ago, let's face it, the sort of top of the hype cycle there. Now fintechs are actually worried that they're going to be disrupted by decentralized finance companies, and they're not even necessarily startups, some of these. So everyone is being disrupted at an increasingly accelerating rate in increasingly surprising ways, like construction. I can 3D print you a building 90% faster than a traditional construction company and for 90% less cost. Yeah, these aren't just minor incremental disruptive things that we are seeing. These are significant, what we call system level changes. So from a board's perspective, you've got to not only understand what the future of your own industry does look like or could look like, but you've also got to understand basically what the future of other industries looks like as well. Because as we all become increasingly digital organizations, digital is very good at eroding all of the individual boundaries between previously distinct industries. If you ask a bank, what industry are you in? They'll say, well, savings, loans, mortgages, whatever it happens to be, wealth management, estate planning, etc., etc. You go and ask a retailer, what industry are you in? Well, we are in the selling stuff business. You go and ask an entertainment company. Well, we're in the business of entertaining people. You go and ask the same question to a technology giant like Facebook, Alibaba, Google, Amazon, Baidu, Apple. What industry are you in? And they will say all of them, because they are digital natives. They are digital by design. And as a consequence, Amazon, basically, which started as an e-tailer, is now basically the US's third largest loans company. They are in healthcare. They are in entertainment. They are in logistics and transportation. They are in manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, if you step back 10 years ago and you went and had a sit down basically with the CEO of Volkswagen and Audi or General Motors and said, I think that one of your largest competitors in the future could be A, a company you've never heard of before, Tesla, and B, Google. What do you think the CEO basically on the board basically would say about Google? They'd go, you're an idiot. Google are a search company. There is no way that Google in the future is going to be a competitive in the transportation and mobility space. And yet in America, they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The world gets crazier. But if you haven't got a point of view, not only on what's going on in your industry, but other industries as well, which then brings us back to foresight teams, et cetera, then you're going to get run over by the future increasingly. And as for the point of not being able to predict the future, because actually I see quite a lot of futurists saying you can't predict the future. You can only make different risk and probability assessments. Everyone can see the future to different degrees. So I've asked people this question. In the future, is your mobile broadband speed going to be faster or slower? Okay, faster. Is computing power going to be faster or slower, even with the slowdown of Moore's law as we switch to quantum computers, neuromorphic computers, DNA and biological computers? It's going to be faster. What's the future of transportation? Most people who aren't futurists are going to be able to say, I think it's probably self-driving cars and electrification, electric vehicles. Well, how do you know that? Because they see all the different data points coming through. You don't have to be a futurist to see basically that in the future, vehicles are going to be electric because the governments are banning the sale of combustion engine vehicles. We see more EVs on the road. EV ranges are increasing. We're seeing more traditional automotive manufacturers actually ditching the combustion engine. We're seeing supercharger networks being installed around the world. We're seeing legislation actually coming through which promotes electric vehicles over gas guzzlers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You haven't got to be a futurist in some respects, basically, to actually predict what's next. But the further out that we go and the broader our range of view, the harder it gets. So we can predict generally what's going to happen in the short term with some degree of accuracy. Are deepfakes that we said before, are deepfakes going to get better in terms of quality or worse? Better. Now, are they going to have a greater impact basically on all of our own individual trust and democracy? Yes. You don't have to be a futurist to see that deep fakes basically are going to be a greater problem in the future than the past. Cybercrime, is it going to be more of an issue in the future where everything's connected and we have more sensors connected to more things? Yes. Wow. I mean, you don't have to be a futurist basically to see any of that stuff.
Matthew, this is a really important part of the conversation because I've been starting to think about whether boards can continue to play this once a quarter, almost reactive role from an oversight perspective, or because of how the speed of things are changing and evolving, would boards need to become more active and engaged in kind of monitoring what's happening in the business and value chain more actively? So one of the questions I had in my mind, and this is possibly for another day, we can talk about predicting the future and whether or not that is possible. But good governance could mean that you can create a different outcome in the future, and how can boards enable that to the best of their ability? So Matthew, while this is playing out with global leaders and corporate leaders, you and I, the youth who are coming into the market and who are currently disillusioned, unemployed, many of them, and also the aging population means that we can't think of retiring at 55 or 60 like our parents or grandparents did. So if we look at SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, how will individuals of the future earn money, spend money, and build wealth?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So when we have a look at traditional capitalist models, basically, as the World Economic Forum always ends up debating, basically at Davos, they say, so what we have is we have an increasingly polarized society, basically from a wealth perspective. Rich people are getting richer, poor people are actually getting poorer. And typically everyone at Davos basically says, this is awful. What we're going to do is we're going to do something about that to address the wealth inequality gap, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the gap gets wider and wider and wider. And a lot of the news reporters, basically, that, for example, I speak to, just say, it's all talk. Basically, where's the substance? Where's the action on the ground? However, when we actually have a look at the increasing wealth gaps, it's kind of a construct, basically, of where we are as a society today. Because as I've already mentioned, as an individual, I can create a product. It could be, I could sell it for $1. But if I can hit all the right execution levers, I could sell my $1 product to 3.5 billion people on the planet. And in next 5, 6, 7 years, 7.5 billion people on the planet. And all of a sudden, I'm a billionaire. So when you have a look at multi-sided platform models, like Amazon, like Apple, like Google and everything else, because they're digital and global, Google's total addressable market now is 3.5 billion people. And when everyone else on the planet is connected, their total addressable market is 7.5 to 8 billion people. If you were a company about 50 years ago and you wanted to try to actually hit a market size of 8 billion people and actually have 8 billion customers, you could have done it, but basically would have been darn expensive, excuse my French. And then, so on the one hand, basically, when we sort of bring it back to your question about individuals, firstly, individuals need to realize basically that they are the most powerful versions of themselves that have ever existed. If you want to start a business, it's cheaper than ever before. If you want to access funding, crowdfunding is available on tap. If you want to access resources, if I need the world's top quantum physicist, I can reach out right now via email or a variety of different social networks and say, hey, Bob, will you help me build a nuclear fusion reactor? I think it'd be a great idea. You have access to resources that you couldn't have actually touched before. In addition to that, when we have a look at gig economy workers, 30% of workers are now gig economy. Increasingly, when we have a look at younger generations, they aren't working one job, they're actually working 2 or 3. So we're actually starting to see a significant shift in people moving away from sort of complete full-time work to having a few jobs. By night I'm a programmer, by day basically I'm a graphic designer, and in the morning basically I'm a taxi driver, that kind of stuff. So we're starting to see that sort of come through to the workforce. But in terms of capitalism, capitalism still generally is predisposed to treating workers as commodities. If you have a look at warehouse workers, if you have a look at logistics workers, I know plenty of delivery drivers who have to do anywhere between 100 to 150 deliveries a day. Come on, you wouldn't treat a robot that way. So on the one hand, as we move to more ethical capitalism models, how can you actually encourage people to be stakeholders in your own business? So this is where we then start talking about cooperatives, and we see a couple of those. this is where we start talking about the creation of holacratic organizations like Zappa. Zappa is a holacratic organization where everyone is actually the same level as the CEO, which is an interesting one. When it comes basically to wealth management, increasingly you've got to have wealth and assets to manage in the first place. And that alone basically then sort of swings us back round to the future of work and the workforce, which then swings us back round to ethical capitalism and actually making sure that everybody actually has a role to play. But then it also comes back to the power of the individual and the power of individuals, the power that individuals have to become entrepreneurs. So I know plenty of people, for example, that run successful businesses now, but they started the businesses with £50. They went and they created their own websites. They then figured out a sort of social media strategy to create content and whatever it happens to be. Then they got some customers. Then they presented digital first organizations, and suddenly you can be in the UK and you can be selling to penguins in the Antarctic. Generally, when I sort of go around the world, a lot of people don't really feel empowered. I was in the Middle East last week, and there were plenty of people that said, look, I think I've got some really great ideas, but I'm not sure that my leader or my bosses actually listen to my ideas. From a workforce perspective, empower your people. From an individual perspective, if no one is empowering you, empower yourself. There are plenty of opportunities basically to empower yourselves today. And as for potential, as technologies unlock access to new products and services and let us do new things in new ways, if you can't program, for example, we've got artificial intelligences from Google and Microsoft, low-code and no-code platforms. One's called Bayou, the other one's called DeepCoder, that let me talk to a computer and say, build me a program that looks like this. And these things will go off to Stack Overflow, GitHub, scavenge a whole bunch of code, bring it back and say, is this the application you wanted me to create? Increasingly, as technology automates different tasks and jobs, when you slap a pretty interface over the front of that, for example, a vocal or a voice interface over the front of it, all of a sudden I can sit here as a non-programmer and just talk to the computer and say, build me a program, and then publish it to the app stores, and then you can even get an artificial intelligence to market it for you. IBM Watson will not only create adverts for you in some respects, which brings us back to synthetic content, it'll also go and distribute and publish them, as well as copyright them as well.
Matthew, I think there's
in terms of copywriting.
There's so much work that needs to be done, I think, by organizations and leaders to unpack this. And I've shared with you that, one of the biggest contributors to people not achieving their full potential, because I believe that everyone has high potential in something, is this principle of self-belief and self-worth. So we have looked at our salary levels that people place on us to value ourselves, for example, and we look at KPIs and accolades from people above us to acknowledge us. And, as an entrepreneur, one needs to start doing that yourself. And I think there's possibly a huge gap and a huge contribution that leaders who have achieved can give back to particularly the youth and those who are now rising in their careers. But that certainly is an area that one can go into. So, Matthew, I am mindful of your time. And to those who are, futurists and who are excited by looking into the future, these conversations can be exciting. To some, it can be a little bit intriguing, but create some anxiety. So, Matthew, what I'm going to do, I'm going to tap into the Griffin algorithm. Let's call it that. I'll give you 10 questions, and you have about 30 seconds to respond with an answer, and maybe give us the why, right? So StratAstute's philosophy is the integration of purpose, performance, people, and profits. And this is really the basis of these questions I've asked. So here goes. With regards to purpose-driven strategy, if you could apply the next 20 years to one cause as a G20 leader, what would that be?
People. I mean, technically, I should actually say environment, because if you don't have a planet, then you don't have people. That's it. But make people the heart of your strategy, empower them, and bring up their own potential, which is sort of what we've been talking about.
Okay, sustainable profits. If you could advise multinational leaders to work together towards one common goal, what would that be?
Peace. Ironically, if you have a look at the amount of money that we actually spend trying to actually defend ourselves or create offensive military machines, and you started putting that to a more benign use, you could solve global famine, hunger, the poverty gap, and all kinds of different things. That's it. Make peace, not war. But unfortunately, that one won't happen.
Sustaining resilience. So if you and I can comfortably live to, let's say, 120 years old, what habits do we need to cultivate today to remain vibrant, engaged, and actually feel fulfilled?
Keep yourself interested, be interesting, and be passionate about what you do.
Shifting professional identity. So with that interview and conversation with Lloyd Blankfield, what stood out for me that after all those years at Goldman Sachs, he finds it incredibly difficult to shake off that identity and find something fresh to do. So what advice do you have for someone who is ending their leadership chapter or ending their professional identity and shifting to something new? How do they find a new purpose?
Dump the technology, and I've got a story there. So dump the technology, go out and explore lots of different things. So as we can't do with children. So in terms of dumping technology, Mark Benioff basically went on holiday. His wife basically told him that he had to leave his phone and his technology basically in the drawer, which, let's face it, he didn't actually want to do. She ended up locking all of his technology away, and by the end of his 2-week stay, he decided to actually put a new person in charge of Salesforce and do something else.
I absolutely agree. I've taken kind of digital breaks, and they definitely help with creativity. Next one, the pay value. So we've got deepfakes, we've got NFTs, right? What this means is there's a real you and real people, they're real assets and digital assets. How will we be placing value on these two?
So one of my friends basically is the CFO basically of a large global organization basically, and his children keep saying, we want to invest in crypto, we want to buy NFTs, we want to buy digital assets and everything else, to which his response is, once you stop playing platforms like Roblox or Minecraft and everything else, those digital assets are actually worthless. If you've got £10 in your bank account, go and actually buy a physical thing. When we actually have a look at digital assets, we see the fashion industry that are embracing NFTs. So you can buy a Gucci handbag, you can buy a variety of digital dresses for Instagram, for example. There's one for €19,500. But at the end of the day, what do you actually own? You own absolutely nothing. So the digital economy, so NFTs and all this kind of stuff, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, is actually based on owning stuff that actually, ironically, you will never actually be able to own, touch, handle, and then the resale value basically is just about as great as it would be in the real world if it was a real asset.
Yeah, I think that kind of touching it, in other words, having a sense of what you have is important to that feeling of fulfillment, right, and achievement, I guess. Okay, looking at home, office, and commuting, Bezos has said that his commercial space endeavors, his vision is that we're going to be living on one planet and working on the other planet. So what does home, office, and commuting look like in the future?
So if you're living on one planet and then working on another, I'd actually tend to say to Jeff, have you heard of working from home? That's it. Then you don't have to commute to the other planet. Jeff's fairly interesting. He wants to take heavy industry off planet Earth. He wants to build a new international space station. He wants to put 1 million people basically in a rotating space colony. He wants to build a moon base, and actually he's already started turning Amazon into the first moon delivery service via Blue Origin, which is actually his words, not mine. He's interested. But I'd actually say, Jeff, wake up. That's it. Yeah, embrace work from home, Jeff. Live on the moon. Work on planet Earth remotely or using teleoperations.
Communication and information, very important. So, Matthew, what comes after English, Mandarin, email, instant messenger, social media, and Google? What's next?
So if you're Mark Zuckerberg, basically then you hire a lady called Regina Duggan, who was the Director General of DARPA, which is the US bleeding research arm that I mentioned. You then ask her to try to create a non-invasive brain-machine interface that can read people's brainwaves so that you turn Facebook into the world's first telepathic social network where you just think and all of your thoughts spew out onto Facebook. And if you think I'm kidding about that, Mark Zuckerberg about 2 years ago said that he wanted Facebook to be the world's first telepathic social network. I already have technologies that I can show you that will stream what you are thinking in terms of your thoughts, your visual thoughts, to YouTube. So if you think that telepathic communication is a thing of science fiction, go and have a conversation with the University of Harvard, who managed to get 2 people to communicate telepathically 3 years ago, let alone basically what we've been able to do recently by I can teach a robot new things telepathically, courtesy of MIT. So that's the next weird thing, basically, that we'll all see. And then the regulators can have kittens about what happens when all our thoughts spill out onto Facebook.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Looking forward
to that one.
This one, Matt, gut feel. So I don't know if you watched the US Grand Prix over the weekend, but Toto Wolff made a really interesting comment afterwards. He said, the algorithms are not worth anything when the flag drops. Is there a place for gut feel in strategy, Matthew, in the future?
So at the moment, basically, what we have artificial intelligence is still narrow, brittle, and typically it's machine learning-based artificial intelligence, which is based on if this happens, then that. When you have a look at decision-making systems like we see with deep neural networks or deep learning, they're a lot more interesting, but they're still only really good at doing one thing extraordinarily well. However, basically, there is a Japanese organization that has now put an artificial intelligence onto the board. Courtesy of IBM, with IBM Watson and IBM Debater, we are increasingly seeing the use of artificial intelligence in decision making. There is a artificial intelligence called, it's from Caltech, called Liberatus. It's a poker-based artificial intelligence that is now being used by the US military in war games. So when it comes to artificial intelligence being able to actually make decisions, we are starting to get there. This is where autonomous systems, for example, a self-driving car is making its own decisions on the fly. It's not really a machine learning-based system. We will increasingly see more artificial intelligence used in decision-making in the future than less. And actually, a last parting shot on that one. 3 years ago, the Chinese government, as part of their foreign ministry, created an artificial intelligence politician, which is now being used to help them negotiate Belt and Road initiatives around the world. And the Belt and Road initiative is a $1 trillion initiative. So there you go.
Matthew, we are running out of time. I'll stop on this last question around the generational gap. So what life, career, and educational guidance do you share with your own children?
So they've got to be, so you have to have hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills basically should be interchangeable. Today I program in binary. Tomorrow I program a quantum computer. The day after I program basically in synthetic DNA. So biological computers and DNA computers actually already exist. People can go and look those up on Google for a laugh if they like. However, when we have a look at the soft skills, basically children have to be able to collaborate, and we do, but children have to be able to be collaborative. So collaborate with humans and with machines. So whether it's digital humans or whether it's actually decision-making artificial intelligences or personal digital assistants like Siri, Bixby, and Google. They also need to be entrepreneurial. They need to be curious. They need to have ethics baked into them, because a lot of these technologies are increasingly powerful. I've already said basically how I can create a new type of virus that wipes out humanity. You know, maybe the politicians will listen to this and actually figure out a response. We also need to be good at storytelling. We need to be resourceful, all these kinds of things. We need to be empathetic, which is where the sense of community, basically, and togetherness actually comes in, which is then where we kind of see the antisocial networks basically kicking in, because we have an increasingly polarized society. So all these, when we have a look at the future of children, they've got to be highly adaptable, resourceful, ethical. They've got to be entrepreneurial. They've got to be able to think exponentially, because my kids basically all of a sudden have the power to change the lives of 1 billion people or influence decisions basically made at a planetary level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole story there, but you know that's a 50,000-foot view.
Well done, Matthew. You didn't pass 30-second test, but very good answers there. And you know, it's almost such a beautiful time for parents and children to grow together into this new future that's unfolding in front of us.
Yeah.
Matthew, I had no doubt that we'd run out of time, and we did, but I feel completely energized after this conversation. There's just so much work ahead, but so much growth to harvest. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, this is it. There are lots of threats out there, but there's a huge amount of opportunities. And actually embracing these opportunities is generally down to you as an individual. That's it. If no one's doing it for you, do it for yourself. And then if you're not doing it for yourself, you can't complain basically that no one else is doing it for you in the first place.
Matthew, I look forward to seeing you and meeting you when you come to South Africa next, and hopefully that is soon. Listeners, I hope that you were equally gripped with this conversation, and we'd love to hear what your thoughts and your comments, so please do send them through to us on www.stratastute.co.za, or when we post this video on LinkedIn, please do leave your comments there. Matthew, do you want to share your details?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to get hold of me or see what I do, basically then I put a huge amount of free information about the future, the next 50 years onto my website. So go to www.311institute.com. All my social media links basically are there. You can go and check out my YouTube channel, basically where we talk about the future of everything. So every different sector, every different topic, basically that we've covered here. I've got reports and codexes. If you go to the insights section, there's loads and loads of different stuff basically that you can dig around with. And then if you're interested in anything, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you've got any questions, same thing, get in touch, have a chat, reach out. Let's see if we can help you unleash your own exponential potential.
Thank you, Matthew. So I'd be remiss to end this conversation and not refer to Stephen Hawking, the physicist. I'm a fan. He says for millions of years, mankind lived just like the animals. Then something happened which unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk and we learned to listen. Speech has allowed the communication of ideas, enabling human beings to work together to build the impossible. Mankind's greatest achievements have come by talking, and its greatest failures by not talking. It doesn't have to be like this, he said. Our greatest hopes could become reality in the future. With the technology at our disposal, the possibilities are unbounded. All we need to do is to make sure that we keep talking. So this brings us back to the present. Let's keep these conversations going and stay subscribed to this channel so that your strategies are better contextualized. Thanks to Moby Learn Africa, who are on a quest to assist citizenry in unlocking the full potential of smartphones and other mobile devices. They're also doing some really good work on video and digital technologies. My parting note to you, as always, lift each other as you rise so that together we can thrive. Till next time, take care and goodbye.